its conditions, who try to play within the extremely vague boundaries of acceptability, and just those who are the most ruthless and cunning, there is always a very slim chance that you may either achieve redemption or some upward mobility back into the slightly less lethal lower hive. It may sound strange, but remember that some Astartes will in fact recruit from feral worlds because of their keen sense for survival and combat skills. Now this is similar within the Underhive. It's not especially common, but some within the Underhive can be of an age that make them appealing candidates for Astartes. Usually they're battle hardened from an early age and open-minded enough that they can be moulded easily by being given the chance to become superhuman warriors of the Imperium rather than a miserable short death in the chemical pits of a hive city. I think if somebody gave you those two options, fairly easy to know which one you were going to opt for. Now, it need not be Astartes though. Many hive cities will contain in the upper levels what is known as a Schola Progenium, and this is where orphans are usually hardened into officers for the Imperial Guard or other branches of Imperial service. So even there, down in the lower levels, candidates may be chosen. Now, say chosen, it's more likely the Arbites would smack them unconscious and they just wake up in a barracks being told, this is what you're going to do now. But either way, the Underhive can be a very fertile ground for some of its most high-status individuals whose early life was tempered into the perfect skill set by the worst conditions and the terrible necessities of raw human survival, which one might hope at least someone somewhere was able to appreciate the irony of. Hive cities are sometimes referred to as an arcology. To my mind, this term should only be loosely applied in relation to hive cities, if indeed at all. I think I have possibly used this description myself in the past, and if I did, I would now retract that, and I'll clarify for you why. It's because when I came back to thinking about hive cities, at first your mind thinks, oh, it's a big self-contained city, it's an arcology. Well, no. Because you see, an arcology is not completely wrong. It's just not a particularly good definition. And the primary reason for this being that the fundamental concept of what is known as an arcology, while yes, it is a large structure which will contain habitation, industry, and in general, all the things we consider necessary for a city to function contained in one massive structure. And I should note, actually not necessarily just industry, but work. But this is coupled with the concept that by design, an arcology is meant to actually minimize human impact on both its surroundings and environmental effect, neither of which could generally be said to be true of a hive city. In fact, most Imperial hive cities are incapable of even providing the base requirements needed by the citizens within, which is generally another feature of what you would define as an arcology, that it should be self-sustaining. Imperial hive cities are generally unable to be self-sufficient because of the sheer size of the population, which additionally exerts a high degree of pressure on all infrastructure and resources. When you think about it even a little bit more, a hive city is the majority of the time the complete polar opposite of an arcology. The only thing the two have in common is being a sizable artificial structure containing a lot of people, and that's where the comparison ends. On many hive worlds, the planet itself has suffered to the point of death as a result of the obscene populations it was forced to try and support. On many hive worlds, they have nearly always been turned over to industrial processes or suffered complete ecological collapse millennia ago. This is certainly, at least in part, due to a planet containing multiple hive cities, or what are known as hive clusters. It's definitely worse on these worlds. And it's not to say that all worlds where hives exist are just bereft of an ecological system that still functions. Otherwise, this would mean the majority of Imperial worlds in the galaxy were just dead planets, and that is not the case. Whereas an arcology is a futuristic, idealistic, utopian vision of human habitation designed to meet all the needs of its citizens, efficiently optimizing space and having minimal impact on its surroundings in all respects, if you line up all of that against what an Imperial hive city is, it's very clear the comparison does not fit at all. So was there ever a time long in humanity's past where hive cities were what we might consider to be an arcology? Now that, my friends, is the right question. A hive city of the Imperium might perhaps be best described at this point as simply a megastructure. Of course, hives are not one singular structure, it's simply how they appear externally because of their size. So we might consider a terminology like something, say a mega conurbation, to refer to a development where you have areas of habitation that just expand until they eventually fuse together into a large town or city, or in the case of hive cities, one massive mega city structure. not all hive cities would necessarily have started out as towns or small cities that were spaced out and built upon organically. They would certainly have begun structurally as a loose but planned collection of base structures back in the golden age of mankind, maybe domes and so on, and then they were built upon until someone or something decided that the best option was building up and not out. Hive cities now exist as conglomerations of structures all layered endlessly on top of one another, stacked structures built of heavy rockcrete and plasteel, so high on some worlds that their towering spires have begun to pierce the highest layers of a planet's atmosphere. But the earliest foundations for these areas of habitation were set many thousands of years ago, although just as and when this exactly occurred is of course completely debatable. But when you think about it, the grand concept of what an arcology represents does seem to fit more within the outlook during the golden age of humanity, that is, the dark age of technology, than it does within the age of the Imperium. Because in the 41st millennium, citizens' well-being and environmental impact are not especially high on the agenda for the Imperial Administratum. On the other hand, if this were the case, you might imagine that hive cities would surely even now not be quite as bleak and dilapidated as they are. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's worth remembering that the war with the Men of Iron, compounded by the Age of Strife, which incidentally went on for roughly 5,000 years, completely annihilated much of humanity's achievements and culture. So it should not be unreasonable to imagine how, over the course of some 5 millennia, a period during which many worlds, if not the majority, were subjected to apocalyptic war, internal conflict and just harrowing slaughter, where humanity essentially fell back into the darkest periods of low-tech and tribalistic barbarism. So it should almost be expected that these structures could have been, if not significantly damaged, then at the very least extensively repurposed and stripped down for materials likely for war or for outlying settlements. Now, I will note at this point that descriptions regarding hive city origin in terms of construction and materials used make for this to be a very confusing picture. And this is always the trouble with the 40k verse, that there is so much that seems contradictory or leading you off on different tangents. Half the puzzle is coming to your own conclusion based on what's available and cutting away the references that don't really seem to fit. Now, in this instance, I personally haven't come to a clear enough conclusion about this, because hive cities are phrased sometimes as if they were only fully constructed after the Golden Age. But that doesn't make sense, because other evidence and logical context points to them being very much constructed in the Golden Age. First, let's explore more, and then I'll give you my final thought on the matter. So this is where we come to the classic linchpin for any and all of these origin debates: STC designs. Now, there's only one period where STC designs originate from, and it is definitely referenced that some areas of a hive city at the mid-level within a hive's spire structural space are designed to STC guidelines. Now, this can mean two things. Of course, it suggests to us that hive cities can be readily established well into the Dark Age of technology, as this was the period when we know STC designs were being produced, not before and not after, although, like I say, devil's advocate, this period is very unclear to us. On the other side of things, maybe it just means that they have found an STC in terms of building stuff and they're using it within a hive city. Although, I will note, as I've repeatedly said before now, I've only found a few references to this, not several, so again, take it with a pinch of salt. Still though, as I always say, references are certainly important, but so is context. And it seems fairly logical, doesn't it, that when placed in context, structures like hive cities would make good logical sense to have originated from a period where humanity was operating seemingly on a standardized template system across the galaxy. This would certainly help us also to explain why hive cities are so surprisingly widespread. It also makes sense when we consider the scant details we know from humanity's golden age, that in this time they existed at peak technological levels, which, even if we give the Imperium a fairly wide amount of leeway, I would argue it's very debatable that they would have the general knowledge to construct such vast towers all across the galaxy. We know that they can construct big machines like the Titans, they can create huge defenses, they can create ships that travel the galaxy, so they can create all this stuff. However, a lot of these things still have original origins to do with STC from the Dark Age of technology. So as I say, I just question whether or not they could do this on such a widespread scale. Whereas, on the other side of things, within the Golden Age, the concept of creating a correctly functioning arcology seems considerably plausible and also fits within their worldview of what we can estimate it to be anyway. It just seems more logical that that would be the case. Also, When you consider that many of these colonists arrived at worlds which would have, to my mind at least, initially wanted to concentrate their population to a large degree, because remember, these were not just a ramshackle bunch of frontier colonists looking to create the Wild West, trekking out to stake a claim on a piece of land. They were a very highly advanced population of humans, both ideologically and technologically, and were travelling to new worlds with the specific purpose of colonizing them. So splitting themselves up all across the planet seems a very unlikely choice for them. In fact, from what is speculated about humans in futurism, it's debatable if humans in the Golden Age would still have really even held concepts like individual private ownership for land and materials and so on. And so it may simply have been that working in collaboration with their STC system, which as we know appear very likely to have been a form of advanced AI, as well as, yes, being something akin to a 3D printer, automated production system, plus whatever other help humans had in this time in the form of the stone and golden men, whatever they are, they had a lot of help is what I'm saying basically. Now truthfully, we can't really know to what degree humans were actually involved in planning or even overall decision making in this early time. It may well have been that they just left this to their automated systems to decide, knowing that they would choose the most efficient and best intentioned plans for human comfort and safety. And this would also help to explain why hive cities are not commonly seen on, say, feudal worlds, which can also be known as the night worlds. Now at a very basic level, you could simply say, well, that's because hive cities are very technology based and feudal worlds aren't. Now sure, that is a very blatantly obvious conclusion to make, but it's also missing a very large part of the context. So just allow me another small tangent here. There was a period even during the Golden Age where some parts of humanity apparently started to decide to turn their backs and discard their reliance on AI and high tech over time. Not initially, over time. Now they were resorting then to a simpler way of life. This turned out to be quite the wise decision in the long term, and why many night feudal worlds escaped the worst of the Age of Strife, because many were able to survive fairly intact into the Age of the Imperium. However, despite their abandonment of technology, there was still a time where they had produced things likely according to STC designs, what are now known as Imperial Knights. So these defenders of the population would then seem to have been these high-ranking officials of their colony, but this eventually developed into the feudal system in the form of the noble families, because those piloting the powerful knight machines formed noble knight houses which exist even today in the Imperium. This was a result of their mental interfacing with the knight's machine spirit. But anyway, overall, this rejection of technology seems to be the most likely reason why in feudal worlds hive cities are not very common. If they do exist in any form, they're more like a basic state of development, probably having long been now adapted away from the type of high-tech and more resembling something I would liken to Mervyn Peake's classic creation of Gormenghast. Now, tangent within a tangent, go look up Gormenghast along with the novels Titus Grown and Titus Alone. For those of you on the Audible bandwagon, it's available there and it's about 5 hours each. Anyway, the point is that the fact that hive cities do not appear commonly on night and feudal worlds but do appear widely on just about most other worlds of the Imperium, as I noted earlier, appearing as regularly as on 85% of Imperial worlds, this is not a figure that just occurs from random decision making in different places when such vast distances are involved between the worlds. Still, as I said before, I haven't decided exactly where I come down on this yet. It's very difficult to say when hive cities were widely constructed, but overall I would lean toward them being at least well in progress prior to the Age of Strife, because it seems quite clear that this was a widely adopted and planned design for a different era to me. And given that the vast majority of designs used by the Imperium are created from a similar origin, that being the STC products of the Dark Age, it stands to fair reason that hive cities also, and I want to emphasize this, at a basic level, are a product of AI STC design, and that although they now no longer operate by definition as a true arcology and have essentially rotted away over millennia to become a corpse-like travesty of their original glory, even in the described modern period within the Imperium, some cities on worlds will grow up so large as to become concentrated in huge urban sectors until they overlap as like a conurbation and then eventually begin to expand upward. This is described, but it's my estimation that the time prior to the Imperium is in fact more accurately the origin of hive cities, especially when we consider that some hive cities have been noted by the Mechanicus as being built from materials on their external surfaces that are unknown and unidentifiable to them. And this should lead us to conclude that the materials were constructed in a period where humanity had considerably more knowledge than now, because no Xenos would lend a hand in helping humans construct a city, so it can only have been from our distant past. and that for me is probably the real key there. It is a common tale within hive cities that their original foundings exist deep in the subsurface region, now known as the Underhive, and that the most ruined and crime-ridden sector of hive cities contain actually the deepest secrets of all. Taking expeditions, as I said before, into this section of a hive is very dangerous. Extremely violent places, often populated not just by the most brutal human elements, but also strange creatures, mutant tribes, and so on. There exists, though, the possibility that in a hive city's lowest levels, somewhere in the Imperium, may exist very important remnants, even technology, that tell us about the most ancient history of humanity. In knowing all this, it seems quite a tragedy that they would have at one time been beacons of human achievement, protected by powerful godlike weaponry possessed by humanity during its zenith of the technological age. Who can now imagine just how these towering cities were meant to have appeared? Were they basic practical structures, or were they dressed in crystalline glass or some composite material to make them appear like true beacons of power and light and peak achievement? Not perhaps entirely unlike Eldar worlds during their age of glory before the fall. Hive cities were similarly once long ago undoubtedly a wonder to behold, a quite literal pinnacle of achievement. But now all that remains are the tattered, rotting corpse structures, symbolic of both what we once were and also where we find ourselves now. The disparity between the two should be greatly disturbing, but as so few people in the Imperium will ever know of the former glory of humanity, this is a comparison that few will ever be able to take the time to contemplate or consider. Now, the quite depressing downside to hive cities is that the area around many of them, as I noted earlier, will have been reduced to nothing more than what would appear to be an apocalyptic wasteland, devoid of even the smallest levels of biological life. These ashen wastelands surrounding hive cities are truly a tragedy to witness, having long ago suffered full ecological collapse, and perhaps for the entire planet itself. This is then compounded by many more millennia of pollution. They are chemically saturated lands, extremely hostile to any life itself. The composition of these ashen wastelands can vary significantly from planet to planet. There are some regularly found elements like microplastics, inorganic chemicals. The conditions will nearly always corrode metals within a relatively short period of time, and its toxicity will be enough to kill almost anything. But as always, it varies. Some planets, for example, may be so large that they're in fact partly capable of handling the toxic output of hive cities, whereas others may exist in different strange conditions if the hives are, say, based on what would be largely an ocean world or an ice world and so on. However, by and large, having at least one section of your planet being a destroyed desert wasteland is one of the most common for hive worlds, which makes reasonable sense when you consider the effect of a huge population over time. This is one of the reasons why Terra is now an ecumenopolis. But it's very notable that for any PDF or Imperial Guard, having to defend your hive city while suffering the external environmental conditions is obviously not one that is particularly favourable to humans, and so even a modest assault upon a hive city can in fact be quite problematic. Human defenders suffering significant casualties just from the passive environmental conditions and temperatures alone, not to mention the effect that that can also have on their morale. Some wastelands surrounding a hive city may in fact be so dangerous that they're used as a form of capital punishment, be that based on the temperatures being so high that they just burn the skin off your body in minutes before suffering a full system collapse, or so cold that the result is near enough the same, just on the opposite end of the scale. Some wastelands, the material is so abrasive that again can blind you in moments and cut your flesh to ribbons. Other hive cities will be surrounded by a toxic smog of chemical pollutants that simply being thrown out into the wasteland will lead the condemned to either choke to death, or potentially far worse, those pollutants will attack the body and dissolve them into near enough from the inside out once the contaminants have entered the body. Likely though, the worst fate will be for those thrown out into hive cities surrounded by hundreds of miles of highly irradiated wasteland. Sometimes this can be mild and only be the result of past wars that has degraded over time, but in the more severe cases, some past immense disaster involving nuclear material has caused pockets of very extreme radiation to persist. For those who are forced out into these invisible minefields, they may initially think that they have escaped the worst, just being sent out into exile, not suffered some more brutal fate, but it will in fact not be long before they start to see their skin turning red, black, generally feeling very unwell, and within days their bone marrow will die, followed by the rest of their body essentially disintegrating They're condemned to a very agonizing death, only comparable to the worst attentions of the chaos deity Nergal. Although the most toxic areas of the waste tend to center around a hive city for obvious reasons, beyond this the waste continues on for many thousands of miles, if not covering the entire planet itself in ashen deserts. While sadly the majority of the time this tends to be fairly typical for a world containing many multiple hive cities, certainly it's the norm for those containing hive clusters. Still, having said all of this, some wastes around a hive can strangely still contain life, albeit weird Xenos life, but life nonetheless. In the ashen wastes of some hive worlds, although more complex life is long extinct, you may still find basic algae, bacteria and fungi, although it's usually worth noting that these can in fact also be quite aggressive, and it's one of the reasons why those humans who choose to venture into the wastelands tend to be kept in hab areas separated from internal hive populations, dare they risk spreading some biological contamination. One of the most extreme dangers of being out in the wastes are of course the actual dust and ash storms themselves that ravage planets. Some hive cities have even been reported as having become nearly buried by the worst of these storms, and it's at least believed that some have also been and were lost long ago in their early periods of development because of this. These lost hives are now unable to be detected, having been buried so far underground. I like to imagine again there is the rarest outside possibility that even if the population long ago perished, there may be early hive cities containing a wide array still of Dark Age technology existing out there somewhere buried on a hive world waiting to be unearthed, even now below thousands of years worth of surface matter. For the current living members of hive cities though, ashen storms are dangerous, not just because they can be very disorientating for those who are able to, or simply must, work out in these conditions, but also because the storms themselves whip up all the deposited material, which as we already learned can be extremely dangerous just when it's lying on the ground. Being out without adequate protection in a wasteland storm can mean a person having their flesh literally stripped to the bone in minutes, leaving nothing but a bleached skeleton and the tattered rags that once covered them. Undoubtedly on some hive worlds this will again be a punishment in and of itself. No doubt you might see some sort of pillared structures dotting the wasteland around a hive city where the condemned are placed and left to be sandblasted back to a skeletal form that will then tumble into a pile of wasted bones below. The conditions are harsh enough that it may even be worse than that, and not even bone remains, every piece of you being stripped back to dust. Beyond the individual level though, ash storms on some worlds can in fact be a very serious threat, not just to these wayward individuals but hive cities themselves. The conditions are extreme enough that it's been known for entire exterior sectors of hives, which are usually fairly well protected with reinforced materials, to have been stripped right down, and it has even been reported that some hives were compromised and destroyed by storms that whipped around the planet for centuries, culminating in a truly apocalyptic storm that wipes away anything in its path. On some hive worlds, the scrapped remains of the base or mid-levels of hives that have suffered such destruction are periodically revealed by the shifting oceans of ash, only to be hidden away again for many centuries. On some worlds, notably Necromunda being one of them, Imperial scholars believe that these wastes actually have currents and tides of other subsurface pollutants that rise from the planet's bedrock and form undercurrents that shift these wastes around like an ocean. In other areas where pollutants rise up and cover the surface, they can dry to form what appears to be a dried lake bed hard enough to travel over. But these are often dangerous environmental hazards because below the apparently secure surface is in fact a deep sea of ashen dust like a quicksand and will swallow any who step out incorrectly onto the thinnest parts of these deceitful landscape features. Hive cities are of course fascinating in and of themselves in their design, wider purpose and historical development to have now become one of the primary locations for humanity's population by the end of the 41st millennium. However, as curious as they are just as a place, the far more interesting thing to learn about are the people who inhabit these vast spaces. And this is a topic which you could talk about extensively, so today I'll just be giving a flavoured overview, starting at the very top. Now the Highborn are basically the elite ruling families of hive cities and just in general imperial worlds. They are decadent, wealthy, often crazed and most certainly very disconnected from the reality for those living literally under them. They will breathe clean air, eat imported foods, holiday on lush, verdant paradise worlds and want for very little. Most of the upper spire nobility will have been born into this life of luxury, and never having known anything different has led them to have extremely twisted concepts of humanity, ethics, and morals, and it's fair to say that they're generally not liked by many who serve the Imperium's larger causes. Their lives are very much comparable to that of ancient royalty because most of the time they're dealing with political intrigue, personal vendettas, campaigns of revenge, murder to gain position or status, marriage, illicit affairs, decadent parties, and any number of far worse offences that would likely be classed as heresy if they were discovered in the lower hive spire. They're usually self-obsessed, ignorant about the things that matter, and most of all hungry for power. All character flaws that are a triple threat red flag for the Inquisition, who will try their best to keep agents undercover within hive spires to hear just what they're getting up to. If there was ever to be a very fertile breeding ground for cults of Slaanesh and Tzeentch, hive spires would be the very place to look. Comparative to your average worker though, spire nobles will be relatively well educated about their own lineage, some history of the Imperium, but reminding them also that they are the finest examples of Imperial citizens, of course. They will learn about wealth, economics and trade, politics and power, not to mention continual personal tutoring by their families in the fine arts of social assassination, how to cut down an opponent with razor-sharp wit, how to lay a verbal trap to best slight your enemies in public, and so on. They're not all, of course, disgusting, spoiled brats. Some will have the wherewithal to pose as potential candidates even for the Inquisition and be able then to infiltrate other hive spires to report in on the goings-on to their masters. Some hive nobility will be directly tied also to the goings-on of a hive world, be it say a shrine world, mining operation, trade hub or Astra Militarum bastion. This will to a degree influence those within the hive spire, and they may be slightly less or slightly more corrupt and immoral as a result, and this will generally be relative to how under the lens of the Imperium they are. On a backwater mining world that just spews wealth from lucrative ore trading, things are probably going to get pretty nasty, but on an Imperial military bastion world it's going to be more difficult to keep your disgusting murderous campaigns against rival offspring or questionable trade deals out of sight. Now the Underhive may also see the occasional appearance of what are known as Spirers. Now, as the name suggests, Spirers are upper hive noble members, usually younger peers who are sent to essentially prove themselves by eradicating some undesirable vermin. They will don highly advanced, possibly even Dark Age level hunting suits that are constructed off-world. The origin of these is unknown, although a fair guess from me would be that it involves Jakiro. Sometimes these suits are akin to something like an exosuit, and it provides these high levels of protection, firepower and camouflage as they engage in one of the most foul and decadent activities, human hunting. Hive nobles would tell you that this is a rite of passage and that besides it serves a purpose in eliminating the worst elements of a hive city. To a degree, this may well be true. However, it seems almost certain that there is a darker side to Spira hunting, and that within some hives it becomes more like a competitive sport and more than likely will involve excessive levels of gambling, potentially with even live video feeds being pumped back up into the high spire. By and large, the activities of Spiras are probably far more disturbing than just being some ancient occasional rite of passage. That may sound surprising, but various Space Marine chapters will in fact keep a form of structure on hive worlds that they believe hold either critical tactical importance or were just good for recruitment. Of course their home planet is discounted here, as on that world they will be just everywhere, but on other hive worlds it may be something more just like a simple chapel, a keep, an outpost. It may not be permanently occupied either, but it will nearly always be placed at one of the very highest levels on the hive city's spire, because it's very rare that ordinary citizens would be able to catch a glimpse of these glorious Astartes coming and going. Now, as I think by now we have easily illustrated, for many ordinary human inhabitants of a hive, their existence is grim in the extreme. Conditions are harsh, and so is the work. Only those able to work will be granted accommodation and credits, and this is usually a very overcrowded accommodation, very unsanitary. Despite this, many mid-level workers are considered in fact to be lucky by those forced to exist in the lower factorum levels, because those lower level workers have never felt anything like a sun ray and will hold the open streets and spaces within the mid-levels to upper spire sections as in fact glorious places. And in fact it's reasonable to say that they are, because at least in comparison to the choices of the infinitely more polluted and violently dismal locations in the lower hive, you'd pick those upper areas every time. The best summary for workers and citizens is that their lives are fairly simple. They will grasp small pleasures where they can, they will try and have a family where they can, and put the majority of time in their work. They will give prayer and faith in the emperor, likely attending regular services at the behest of the ecclesiarchy that are always patrolling the hive. They'll try to stay out of trouble, they'll try to make the odd black market deal here and there, they'll have some children, and then, like I say, probably an early death by the standards of anyone above the working class grade. Life in a hive is astonishingly comparable to the industrial period of old Earth, polluted, simple, often violent, and with the worker being exploited almost from the moment they're born till the day they die, lying exhausted, burned out in some appalling industrial accident. The Ministorum will maintain at least a very basic presence on nearly all Imperial worlds in the current period. They will be sure to maintain the heavy indoctrination of the Imperial citizen into worship of the Holy Emperor. Of equal importance, they will be very mindful to keep an eye out for anybody who is behaving suspiciously or reportedly speaking out against the Imperial Creed. A very unwise move for any Imperial citizen who is probably unaware the consequences that are likely going to come their way, which will, let's say, be probably very medieval. Sororitas, like the Astartes, are not extremely common across the worlds of the Imperium, but if they find a reason through some miraculous event they personally witness, or something or someone that they believe that must be protected for the Emperor and his divine power to lead them to a hive world or hive city, they may choose to found a small convent within the hive city. This will be usually a very great privilege for the hive, certainly for the ecclesiarchy, and few would refuse such an honour to come their way. The presence of a sororitas shrine or convent within a hive will likely lead the citizenry to, if they were not already, double down their faith for the emperor, and it's possible it may be where a hive world begins a path towards becoming designated as a shrine world. As we've discussed within a hive city and its feudalistic power structures often being based around noble houses, hereditary succession, the mid to lower sections of hive cities are governed by guilds, which are really just downsized versions of the larger spire nobility who control the hive itself and sometimes the planet or even the wider star system. Guilds, though, will usually be focused on mercantile operations or services for the population. So, for example, the Water Guild is going to deal with, you guessed it, processing and recycling water extracted from polluted sources, also supplying industrial processes where needed. There are others like the Promethium Guild who deal with, right again, promethium, which is basically a liquid fuel in the 41st millennium that can be used in industry, but it's also used for weapons like flamers. There are many others, of course, like the Corpse Guild, Air Guild, Electro, Iron, Coin, and so on. Some hives will have specific guilds, others may not, based on their individual purposes, but essentially if it's something a hive is actively involved in importing or exporting, there's probably going to be a guild for it. Thinly unifying all of these in a hive will be a more collective merchants guild. Now, as I covered whilst discussing the currency section, merchants are some of the most important because they're often involved in making agreements, contracts, trades, and so on between the necessary resources of the other guilds. So they fulfill a role that is difficult for others to take the time to set up on their own. And this places them as something like a middle ground that is often required to be fairly neutral and to best serve everybody's needs. And it goes without saying, of course, including their own. Now, I thought that I would take time to note one guild specifically, as most are relatively self-explanatory: water, air, electro, etc. But the Guild of Coin is deceivingly not quite so obvious. By its name you would imagine that it is singularly related to currency. Except, as we have explained, many hives operate a very strange and unofficial system of economy that is a blend of barter, worker credits and tokens. So the term Guild of Coin suggests a more formalized currency system being minted, and this is not in fact what it represents, or sort of. As we know, within the hive, most citizens are heavily restricted to the areas they can visit. You cannot just take a trip up to a level that is outside your authorized area. So within the Merchants Guild, not unlike rogue traders, merchants are given the freedom to traverse through a hive city, so long as this is restricted to the operation of their business. So it then follows that the Guild of Coin are the gatekeepers, because it is they who control the roads and transport tubes that crisscross a hive structure, as well as between districts and sectors. They oversee the transportation of all cargo, and sometimes within hive worlds they may even be designated as monitoring incoming and outgoing goods. So although they're referred to as the Guild of Coin, to me they more represent something like a guild of customs, border and goods operation. They're monitoring movement of materials internally and externally, recording information, flagging unusual requests, not to mention seizing illegal trades and narcotics if they find them, undoubtedly taking the odd backhander here and there. So this title Guild of Coin likely originates from what are known as these masters of coin, and they forge keys for the guild and the clan house convoys. These coins, though, are more like a form of a token. It's a powerful seal allowing the guilds and houses of a hive city passage past the very many way stations, ash gates, and hive fortresses that they require free passage through. The coin token or key is a powerful symbol of the Guild of Coin. Each of these coin masters carry with them staves which have many rings, shackles, hung with all manner of mysterious keys, some clearly ancient, others newly forged. Each one may be cast from the steel of different hives or stones of different roads, granting rights and passage for the guilder who bears it. In terms of currency, the Guild of Coin operates not dissimilarly from any other. They tax their passageways and require tolls from those passing through. So in that respect, they're not unlike other guilds. Depending on the hive, this can come in the form of barter for them, scrips, credits, or even thrones. It may seem as if living in a hive is very much an anything-goes kind of lifestyle, and the people are just murdered on a whim, and on reflection, is living in the underhive really so bad? And the answer is, yes, it is. Although living in the main spire is certainly no ideal life, it's generally preferable to the underhive, where clean air is basically not a thing and criminal enterprise is everywhere. Random killings, shooting sprees, crazed mutants on the loose, brutality just to set an example to others, and of course much, much worse. The underhive is a truly lawless environment for the most part, and only the most hardened and well-equipped law officers will actually venture into these depths. Enforcers, arbites, bounty hunters, spirers on occasion, maybe even mechanicus, sororitas, inquisitors and astartes, but this is very uncommon and not without good reason. The underhive is really a war zone in short, and choosing to live there is very much only for those who have little to live for. In the upper levels, crime is not at all tolerated. Arbites and enforcers will patrol the streets along with the ecclesiarchy and their ever-zealous followers. Crimes for the upper hive dwellers may be far more difficult to detect because they're looking at things like traitors, heretics, those who seek to preach sedition. All of these things fester and corrupt the minds of citizens, and it is the law officer's role to seek these out and purge them from society. For any crime committed, it will be important that the guilty party has each crime duly recorded with distinction so that they may be assigned to the appropriate punishment. And if it's speaking against the Imperial Creed, then the Ministorum will administer justice. If it's against the tenets of the Adeptus Terra, the Arbites will be involved. Mutants, heretics and cultists, they could fall either side of this. Now, as we learned earlier, within a hive, its citizens' only option is to consume heavily recycled air, water and food of usually very questionable origins. It would be fairly stupid to not point out that this inevitably will have a debilitating effect on the citizenry over time. So the mortality rate based on this and the heavy workload placed upon workers leads to very poor health. Beyond that though, it also will lead to heavy toxins saturating through the bodies of citizens, and in some cases this will start to cause genetic instabilities, birth defects and mutations. The effects of these are demonstrably worse the further down through a hive you travel, where toxins are becoming ever more concentrated. Now, depending on the hive city you find yourself on, this may be more or less tolerated. On some worlds, mutation is more common, and so minor deformities are tolerated to a degree, even in the upper hive. On others, though, any minor defects can be considered signs of chaotic contamination, or potentially entire families could be put to death as a result. So it's very understandable that mutations will want to be concealed and, where necessary, exiled to lower levels or worse than this. It's sadly all too common that conspicuous mutants will be rooted out and destroyed according to the strict laws of the noble houses and the hive administration. Those who are able to flee or newborns given passage may escape and perhaps start new lives in the depths of the underhive, but here they're less likely to be called out because everybody is trying to avoid something. Only those though with the severe mutations will likely encounter difficulty and may again have to flee down into the lower sections of the underhive. Generally speaking though, mutants can live relatively peacefully within an underhive, as ever though it is a sliding scale. Mutants, just like any citizen, may just meet the wrong individual on the wrong day, and things in the underhive have a habit of escalating to lethal violence very quickly. The gangs of the underhive are of course synonymous with hive cities. The lower regions of a hive city have sparse resources, and where some gangs will fight for territory just to push illegal narcotic trades or for the rights to exploit resources, others will do so simply to be able to just stay alive. Most will also fight for things like respect and fear-induced prestige, not to mention their personal wealth. Although the underhive economy is not necessarily directly linked with the levels above, the hive gangs will of course be gaining access to the same credit system and potentially even thrones, so they may be able to indirectly make black market trades or gain access to guilds above to make arms deals and so on. In truth, the link between the lower levels of the hive city and the underhive are probably more closely linked than authorities would want to admit. Legitimate guilds would be more than willing to sell wares down or bring stolen goods up. The guilds carry significant power and usually have the guns and muscle to back this up, and so represent just as much of a force to be concerned about as the gangs. The underhive communities are nothing like the world above though, with only a thin veil of order holding things together, and despite the difficulties there is a never-ending stream into the underhive, and those who venture down will have their own reasons for doing so. But whatever the reason, it likely won't be long before they run into their first gang encounter, and for many this will be a very make or break experience. It's rare for a gang to recruit from encounters with newbies into the underhive, but on the off chance that they're able to stand their ground or even kill a juvenile gang member, there's a reasonable chance that they'll be recruited and gain all the benefits a gang offers, like protection, more reliable access to food and shelter, and of course just a more enjoyable life than scavenging. Obviously the bad aspects though of gangs are having to deal with your rivals, not to mention bounty hunters, enforcers, and being sent on raids for insane objectives, with slim chances of success having been conceptualized by some drugged up, crazed gang leaders. There are of course any number of variations that can exist as something akin to a gang in the underhive, renegade tribalistic offshoots of lost human souls from the age of strife, bizarre Xenos gangs and chaos cultists, or just use your imagination. Perhaps you have a gang of traitor sororitas who have fallen the first stage of their testing and escaped to a life of blasphemy in a city's underhive. What about escaped prisoners from a hive city's penal workforce, or maybe deserters from the Imperial Guard working now as mercenaries just trying to survive? It's one of the best and most interesting aspects of hive cities and the underhive. The characters, the backgrounds of those you will find there are almost limitless, and we'll explore these in more detail in future overviews focused on specific groups, factions, characters, and maybe speculative creations of my own. Lastly, on planets where the surrounding environment may be very harsh, but not enough to kill you within the hour or less, there are those hive citizens who, for one reason or another, choose to leave behind the vast cities. They may form a small group, maybe at one time they were a small guild, and decide that they're better off leaving the hive behind. They perhaps hope there is some small area of the planet not ruined by the seemingly infinite ash and polluted wastelands. For others, they may become these strange nomads surviving off of the very curious life forms that have found a way to survive out in the drifting deserts. Some of these nomadic tribes have been said that they even come to appreciate the ash wastes, that they see them as being beautiful, displaying bright colours at times from undoubtedly the various strange metallic pollutant chemicals, but just why human citizens might choose to leave the hive can be very hard to say. But dwellers in the underhive might for example decide that things have become simply too dangerous. There are those maybe in the upper hab levels of manufacturing who just become very disillusioned by the prospect of endless menial labour, no matter how glorious the apparent cause is. Overall, those who seek a life outside the hive will be seeking something. But who can really say what? Perhaps they simply have just concluded that a life of extreme poverty and close quarters habitation in a decaying ruin of what might have been an arcology, while being subjected to endless religious and strict judicial enforcement, is not for them, and the world outside, as harrowing and extreme as it is, becomes infinitely preferable. Who knows? On many planets that hive cities are found upon, the planet itself can be far bigger than Terra or old Earth, and so by some miracle these nomadic humans may one day walk far enough that they find themselves in an idyllic corner tucked away where they can find a small settlement and live out a subsistence life, disconnected from the oppressive and often extremely hazardous life under the Imperium of man. In the darkened future of the Imperium, hive cities are complex, numerous, and almost infinitely variable in their internal structuring, population, and individual histories. While they remain awe-inspiring in many respects, all too often they are rotten on the inside, decaying ruins built over, upon, and through the crumbling structures of once glorious colony domes to vast citadels. They now exist not as icons of humanity's technological zenith, but a far more depressing symbol of the need to churn out the raw materials of mankind, the sacrifices of flesh and bone demanded by its leaders, only to be endlessly thrown into the meat grinder of the Imperium's unending galactic wars. Wars perpetually fueled by both internal and external conflicts, themselves all too often stirred up by members of the Imperium itself, not to forget of course the numerous Xenos who never cease in their violent testing of the weak points along the Imperium's borders. Hive cities serve mankind in all of its conflicts. They feed its insatiable desire for the materials of war, hardware, munitions, but most of all, their never-ending production of millions upon millions of human souls that remains the only true currency of the Imperium of mankind. While it's undoubtedly true that the world of the dark far future is one filled with horror, immorality and nightmarish perversion, it's also true that while many billions lead lives that are objectively unendurable, there are equally those who are gifted rare positions of privilege, luxury and highly rewarding lives of service. Whilst the Imperium may demand loyalty, it's an unavoidable human trait that has existed forever, that given the opportunity, individuals will always seek the feathers to line their own nests. While some are heavily indoctrinated into the cult of the Imperium and live lives of pure service and abstinence, there are likely significantly more who live lives that are hedonistic, luxurious to excess, boundless freedoms, or how about just sheer raw power. Again, as before, it's worth mentioning that often what I might designate as a job in the Imperium may or may not fall within our understanding of such a thing at this time. Often within the Imperium you're not actually paid, you might simply be assigned a duty through hereditary or just assignment, and you find that your life leads you down a certain path and a certain role to play. So what we might designate as jobs are more roles in society to play, but it's much the same. You're working to stay alive and contribute to the overall structure of human society. As we look at the best jobs today, if you missed out on the worst ones, check the link at the end of this video, and we're covering roles in this video with no constraint. But perhaps we can also look at more standard working class roles that do not include positions of excessive power in another video. And lastly, what would you like me to cover next in a best or worst rundown? Best weapons, worst deaths, best war machines? Tell me in the comments and maybe I can cover that one next. So in no specific order, let's run down the best jobs within the Imperium of Man. Now, it's no surprise that we start with the role of the Inquisitor. There are few roles less coveted than that of becoming an Inquisitor of the Imperial Inquisition. For many, the simple reasons for this are twofold: freedom and power. Inquisitors, unlike the majority of humans in the Imperium of Man, are free to pursue their own goals and missions, within the context of their role, of course, to protect and further the interests of humanity. The Inquisition at its current existent state is a massive organisation in the Imperium. Answerable to no one other than the Emperor and themselves, they reign as terrifying figures to most of the rest of humanity. Take your pick of the three Ordos as well as to which to best participate in. The Ordo Malleus deals with eradicating demons and the servants of chaos, basically hunting the corrupted, and they're also backed militarily by the Grey Knights. Not a bad team to call for backup. The Ordo Xenos are not purely focused on slaughtering the oddities of the galaxy, they also spend time investigating, cataloguing, exploring if you will, to better understand where and when humanity may want to lay down swathes of purging fire. They may spend decades travelling and recording what they discover, and they often have solid bonds and connections with rogue traders. The Ordo Xenos, similarly to the Ordo Malleus with its Grey Knights, gets to call upon the Astartes of the Death Watch, a force formed entirely of veteran Space Marines. Finally, the Ordo Hereticus. Often these Inquisitors are those that people lean toward, choosing them because they are the witch hunters, and rightfully they're feared by the heretics of humanity. They hunt down rogue psychers, mutants of mankind, and those who would speak heresy toward the Imperium and the Emperor. Speaking out of turn, heresy. Spilled my beer? You better know that's some heresy. And as per the previous choice, yes, they are backed not only by the Adeptus Astartes, but also the Adeptus Sororitas, that is the all-female militant wing of the Imperial cult's ecclesiarchy. So if being able to walk around the worlds of the Imperium indiscriminately killing those who might look at you the wrong way doesn't appeal in and of itself, you also get to be backed up by an entourage of badass, bolter-wielding ladies. The Inquisition are, as an organisation and individuals, exempt from scrutiny other than by the Emperor himself and, as I say, themselves. Inquisitors can demand whatever they need at any time, be it materials, citizens, manpower and hardware. In essence, an Inquisitor's power is absolute. They deal out individual death or planetary scale annihilation. The Inquisition is a vast organisation, and it's difficult to really summarise in short order the level of complexity within its own ranks, let alone its operations within the Imperium. The Inquisition is even known to have factional wars within itself from time to time, as it answers only to itself, and so must fight for its philosophies and fanatical points of principle. These rarely will last for any significant length of time, and if they risk spilling out beyond a localized area, they will usually be crushed by a heavy force of Astartes to restore order by any means necessary, at the behest of yet more inquisitional commands. This gives a small sense of how complex and difficult to constrain Inquisitors' power can be, as they individually can wield huge influence in an Imperial system. Why is the role of an Inquisitor one of the best jobs in the Imperium? The answer is the sheer power you hold individually. Now, Imperial Noble was always going to make the cut for the best jobs in the Imperium. They are, as you might expect, the elite civilians of Imperial worlds, and the nobility contain lords and ruling families of major hive cities, planets and star systems. Having power and command over many millions, if not many billions of human lives, you find yourself born into such nobility, then you've already hit the jackpot in terms of potential lives to live. You'll be raised in safety and luxury, disconnected and likely ignorant of the suffering and abhorrent conditions the billions of fellow humans endure below your heavily protected living quarters. A life disconnected from the grim realities known to the majority of individuals within the Imperium, yet it's not a life without risks. Human desire knows no bounds, and murderous ambition and vicious feuds can continue for centuries between families. Many highborn will likely never leave their luxurious palaces, protected from the horrors of the outside world and the citizenry who are best off not knowing what they're missing out on. Highborn citizens of the Imperium are seen, but perhaps only by the nobility itself, as the pinnacle of human bloodlines, representing the greatest and most carefully refined family lineage. As is often the case when it comes to such self-celebrating aristocracy, for the few individuals who are genuinely enlightened or have something positive to contribute, far more of these noble family heirs are self-obsessed, idle, and prone to debasing themselves, often living lives that walk a very dangerous line between indulgence and heresy. Highborn also, among their privileges, are significantly educated about the lives that they live, the power and politics, the general understandings of the Imperium, and how it's best to avoid its significantly dangerous pitfalls. For some highborn, it's a life of ignorance and lavish luxury. For others, their careful education and focused ambition can lead them to become agents of the Inquisition. How much of that is down to loyalty for the Imperium or carefully planned personal ambition is entirely debatable. Being a highborn, though, is not only about wallowing in self-satisfaction. There is work to be done, albeit entirely self-serving. You must protect the interests of the family name, and more importantly, try to better them. It's a never-ending game of carefully planned subterfuge to undermine and steal power from others who need to be taken down a few positions and allow your family a tighter grip on regional power systems. Blackmail, scandals, treachery, and carefully premeditated murder are all day to day. It's a life of dangerous mind games, murder mystery, political power games, and decadent luxury. Despite the dangers, it's without question far preferable to eating slop every day, working to exhaustion, and then dying of some unpleasant industrial contamination. The Adeptus Custodes. Now, a seemingly endless popular suggestion for best jobs in the Imperium, yet somewhat debatable when you really think about it. Overall, though, I still think it's a good candidate, objectively speaking. Why do the Custodes come up so regularly when people think of perfect roles to play as part of the Imperium? Well, for one, the honour of serving so close to the Emperor. The Custodes are the personal bodyguard to the Emperor of Man himself, warriors of unmatched capability and whose sole purpose is to counter any potential threat to the master of mankind. Back in the days of the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade, the Custodes would follow the Emperor everywhere. Now, as he is interred on the Golden Throne on Holy Terror, they rarely leave the planet, taking a far less active role than they once did in the Imperium. And while their tedious daily lives may seem mind-numbing to some, they have seen renewed life as the Ultramarines Primarch has returned to lead humanity. And so it is that the Custodes' days of confinement to Terra over so many years has come to an end, and they reach out with white-hot vengeance to destroy the dark forces of chaos. They stand near immortal warriors, the Emperor's finest gene-crafted warriors. Their dexterity and ability far beyond that of even ordinary Astartes, their minds powerfully refined and fortified, their education extensively studied in all matters. For they exist to not only be powerful defenders, but to serve as companions and counsel for the Emperor himself. They reach out now more proactively than ever, fighting as some of the most supremely powerful warriors that exist within the Imperium, retaining the honour that the blood of the Emperor runs through their veins. They are the golden light of the Emperor himself, his manifested spirit, and only surpassed in ability by the Primarchs and the Emperor himself. To be a Custodes is to be the pinnacle of human design. Their task of defending against the darkness may be challenging, but to stand individually as one of the most powerful and advanced forms of humanity ever created, beings of godlike strength and mental dexterity compared to your average human, bearing ornate crafted armor and weapons, and who is said to have been genetically individually crafted by the Emperor himself, there can be little dispute that the position of a Custodes is greatly revered. Rogue traders are an obvious idolized role within the Imperium of Man, where much of humanity leads assigned lives of extremely limited personal choice. Rogue traders lead lives that are entirely the opposite, lives of exploration and adventure and self-determination. They're able to travel wherever they feel is worthwhile, dreaming and speculating for the betterment of mankind, but also for themselves. Rogue traders lead a life that many can only dream of. Successful rogue traders will also have close-knit teams of specialists around them, experts in diplomacy, exploration, and combat. These individuals, though, unlike others related through their likely noble family ties, will be well-educated, with a strong sense of instinct and cunning, skilled merchants, potentially pirates, and most certainly opportunistic. Rogue traders are truly exceptional individuals, and it's easy to romanticize rogue traders as they rattle on through the void in their customized and potentially Xenos-adapted ships. Some rogue traders even end up feeling so disconnected from the Imperium that they end up feeling no strong ties with it, and they walk a very thin line between loyalty and heresy. The truest appeal to take on the role of a rogue trader, though, is the freedom of exploration and trade that it represents. You're not tied to a specific world, nor are you beholden to oaths of duty and service to the Emperor. You're not going to be sent out on orders back to back from one place to another, dealing with situations and entities that would be enough to destroy the minds of many ordinary citizens. As a rogue trader, you lead a difficult life, but a life where the challenges become their own rewards. Adventure, glory, and riches await the smartest and most capable of rogue traders, and for any who are able to locate the rarest of the rare lost STC templates, eternal glory in the Imperium awaits you. Now initially I was considering not to include a High Administrator in the best jobs list because I considered it to be too close to a planetary governor or a noble. However, it does differ and certainly sits as one of the more cushy jobs available to individuals in the darkness of the far future. Essentially, you would take on the role of a high-ranking bureaucrat, and this is beneficial to you for multiple reasons. One being the scale of the administratum. Even as a senior staff member within its vast sub-departments would allow you to fade into a state of greyness, and this is likely one of the safest positions to occupy within the Imperium. Not being as visible and therefore open to conspirators as a noble, not being so dispensable as an ordinary pleb citizen who nobody is going to miss. You also are a vital cog in the mechanisms that keep the Imperium operating. While you are replaceable, it's going to be in the interests of all to limit how frequently that occurs and risk bureaucratic chaos. Lastly is the ability to remain out of sight and out of mind. Even the head of the administratum at this stage can probably only make a rough estimate of the actual number of divisions that exist inside the apparatus of the administratum. So the likelihood of you being able to live by any standards a comfortable existence with few threats toward you is significantly better than most individuals in the Imperium at the top and bottom of the pile. While your life may not be as lush and luxurious as that of a noble, occupying a high-ranking position is certainly going to accommodate you with comfortable surroundings, and that coupled with the relative safety and anonymity that being a single individual in such a colossal bureaucratic system is arguably still preferable to running the constant risk of having your throat cut unceremoniously in the middle of the night by your father's sister's cousin's son. Now, a Titan Princeps, a return to a role where you get to basically enact vast scales of ruination on the enemies of man. A Titan Princeps, again, while not necessarily the most comfortable of roles, is going to be one many would imagine has its fair share of significant positives. But still, I'm sure some of you are wondering, what is a Titan Princeps? Well, it is a senior officer who commands the world-ending scale of war machines that are known as Titans. And this is something I'll have to cover in a lot more detail later, but essentially a Princeps is a human individual with immense willpower. and this is required because they are ordered to operate a Titan, the massive war machines that tower over battlefields, tower over cities. The Princeps must mentally interface with the machine itself and be able to control the Titan's incredibly powerful machine spirit. It is rare for humans to exhibit the strength necessary, and those individuals are exceedingly rare, as low as 1 in 10 million. For this reason, you as an individual are as near to indispensable as any individual in the Imperium. You'll be heavily guarded, and if your vast war machine were to be disabled in battle, no resource will be spared to recover you. One of the very few situations where the Imperium cares significantly about an individual human life. Operating a Titan is also highly addicting. For perhaps obvious reasons, the Princeps will feel the Titan as if it were their own body. They will feel as if they themselves are this staggeringly dominating war machine of godlike power. This intense, overpowering addiction can often lead Princeps to spiral down into madness as their mind is too heavily strained and they fight against the spirit of the machine itself. Princeps do not individually operate a Titan. The task is far too difficult for one person alone, and will have a team of juniors known as Moderati who assist in other operations and coordinations required to run the Titan. A Princeps, though, is a rare gifted role to play for the Imperium, heavily immersive and symbiotic as the war engine's machine spirit learns from the Princeps and the Princeps from the previously stored memories and experiences of the Titan. It is a position few could ever imagine having the opportunity to be, designated as a commander and operator of one of the most powerful weapons the Imperium holds. To rain down prophetic fury and devastation against the enemies of man with impunity as you look down with powerful superiority upon the ant-like figures that you are crushing, rending, tearing, and exterminating with fire, the fools who would stand against the might, power, and irresistible force of the Imperium of Man. Now, a planetary governor or lord is another position of supreme power that offers those lucky enough to hold the position lives that few could dream of. A governor is a political leader, although not elected, obviously, within the Imperium of Man, and they're also considered an imperial commander when it comes to military decisions. Similarly to other roles in either the administratum or nobility, a planetary governor is often a hereditary position. And I think it's safe to understand why somebody long ago decided that that was a good idea, and it certainly wasn't in the interests of ensuring the right person for the right job. Governors of important worlds within a system may also extend their powers as sector or even segmentum governors. This is to ensure smooth order and running of imperial systems, as the Imperium itself is far too large to be run by a more centralized system. The benefits of being a governor are that while technically you answer to the Adeptus Terra and the Lord Commander of the Imperium, you are essentially completely independent and can run your planet and sector however you deem appropriate. Quite literally, the world is your oyster. You do of course have to adhere to delivering your quotas for the imperial tithe, but as most of your world systems are fairly entrenched and autonomous, this shouldn't be a heavy concern. If you were able to choose, which you wouldn't because the positions are hereditary, but any number of world types exist, and all would hold their own specific benefits to you as a governor. The top of the pile likely being governor of a garden or paradise planet. And yes, these are a thing, believe it or not, in the Imperium. They are worlds of staggering natural beauty, highly cultured places with massive, luxurious restaurants, dancing rooms, maybe even some form of casino for the nobility to enjoy, as well as any number of associated pleasurable activities. Use your imagination. To be a governor of such a world is just about as idealistic a role as you could hope to have. Other planets that could be enjoyable are, yes, feudal worlds, because they're fairly idyllic in one sense, simple people leading simple lives, or industrialized worlds that are not too far from the 21st century on Earth. These are a thing as well in the future. Even hive planets, because while hives for the lower human drones are an intolerably cruel existence, for those at the top of the pile it's quite a different matter. They will have access to just about every luxury you can think of when it comes to urban living. As a governor you have, as with other roles, immense power, and through this power opens up to you a lifestyle that is simply unimaginable to many Imperial citizens. Now, Imperial Guard Commissars. I wanted to include at least one position here from the Imperial Guard because, despite their reputation as Operation Human Shield, there are certainly some positions and roles that could be appealing to some who want to lead a life of military service for the Imperium, crushing its enemies under the weight of Baneblade justice and dealing out furious retribution to heretics. An Imperial Guard Commissar covers various levels of ranking, from default Commissar to Lord and Commissar General. While certainly not the easiest job by any means, a Commissar is an individual with influence, significant respect and power within his regiment or PDF force. A Commissar is essentially a senior commander, empowered by the Imperium to use any means to ensure loyalty and morale of troops, and to achieve objectives whatever the cost. A Commissar will be feared by some, revered by others, often inspiring his troops to leap into battles and take on objectives far beyond sense and reason, and often facing down and succeeding with what appeared to be impossible odds. Commissars are for some a very appealing role because of the supremely uncompromising nature of the Commissar. They are immovable bastions of Imperial will. They will execute their own officers and sergeants just as readily as individual guardsmen if they feel it's warranted. They're certainly not adverse to getting involved in actual combat to make sure things start moving forward and are a success. To me, I often feel that it is this which exemplifies what it means to be a Commissar, that if you want something done right, you do it yourself. This attitude is what I think is most appealing as a Commissar role, to lead by brutal example and expect nothing of your guardsmen that you are not willing to do yourself. And given the significant amount of power struggles, backstabbing and hypocrisy that exists in the Imperium, the role of the Commissar is certainly refreshingly honest, and one which in its honesty is appealing as a straight, no bullshit position to play for the Imperium of Man. Imperial citizens. Okay, now hear me out on this. I know this is a bit vague, and I actually hate myself somewhat for putting in something so vague. But what I wanted to include here is that for all the nightmarish horror and disgusting waste of life that exists in the Imperium, there are also plenty of mid-level roles or planets that do not suffer the same intolerable conditions that others endure. And these lifestyles apply to many roles that you couldn't simply assign to one job. The extremes that we often discuss in the darkness of the far future are always the forefront of what is presented in our view of the Imperium, because so much of it concerns military matters or planets which serve to supply military necessities for the Imperium's forces. However, there are plenty of planets like the previously mentioned Garden or Paradise worlds where the conditions are far from nightmarish. I think that there would be few of us who wouldn't mind being, say, a gardener on a paradise world, or an inventive bartender serving their nobility, an events planner for noble feasts and events, or how about any number of roles on Earth-like industrialized planets not vastly different from our lives today, even feudal worlds with their obviously base level of technology and susceptibility to health issues, but still would lead peaceful lives, arguably idealistic in many ways. On the Hive and more Imperial headquartered planets as well, it's not all bad. There are plenty of mid or mid-senior roles of administration and command that, objectively speaking, are far from miserable and soul-destroying and even relatively comfortable. So this was quite a generalised and vague choice, so I apologise for that, but I feel it was worth noting that there are plenty of ordinary jobs that would be very preferable, even desirable by many, people who are probably leading lives of simple pleasure without the pressure and the threat of being dragged kicking and screaming from your position of power by an inquisitor who suspected that you were getting too big for your boots. Now lastly, yes, Astartes. I know this one will be debatable, and so I say debate away in the comments. I think personally though, how can an Astartes not be one of the best jobs to have in the Imperium of Man? Yes, you face horrors and hardships, but those are prevalent throughout the Imperium. So if you're going to have a life of challenges, why not do it with some style? Genetically modified superhuman soldiers, the Emperor's bulwark against the horrors of the future, godlike figures to your ordinary human citizen who would literally worship the ground you walk upon. You instill fear and submission to all those soft and lazy nobles and governors who have maybe forgotten their comfortable lives exist at the pleasure of the Emperor. It's true that Astartes, the Space Marines, serve humanity, not to rule it. Yet at the same time, in the darkest, most recent days for the Imperium, under the leadership of the Ultramarines Primarch, returned now as Lord Commander of the Imperium, the Astartes maintain their role as mankind's legendary and premier fighting force. Yes, there are those who wield niche, excessive power, like the Custodes or the Grey Knights, but these specialist units are highly specific. The role of an Imperial Space Marine, each chapter with their millennia of history and unbreakable brotherhood, is one of the most appealing roles you could hope to take on. To serve the Emperor as one of his finest warriors, to destroy, purge, exterminate, and bring down vengeance upon the enemies of mankind. Powerful advanced weapons at your disposal, backed up by chapter brothers, each one an expert and fiercely loyal fighter in the name of the Emperor. There can be little finer opportunity than to serve the Emperor as one of his multi-role expert fighters who are truly the most iconic figures that exist in the Imperium of Mankind. I'll finish today by saying, as per usual, thanks for enjoying, participating and supporting me and the channel, guys. If you enjoyed, please tell me what you think down below. If you have an idea for the next best and worst, or perhaps just a rundown of something like most violent creatures, maybe even Worst Jobs Part 2, tell me down below. I got a lot of ideas going into this year, not only 40k, and I hope you're going to enjoy these as and when I get them up on the channel. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. With other
You Umis think you have it hard? Well, the Orcs have the proper tough jobs, and we'll smash the stupid Umis to pieces, and anything else that messes with the Orcs.
Orcs, bigger than your average humanoid of the galaxy, coupled with being angrier, smashier, and far more randomly violent. Generally open to casual brutality beyond most of your more, let's say, measured or at least focused 40k entities, and while the galaxy as we know is a place filled to the brim with acts of extreme violence, the uncommon thing about the Orcs is their generally sunny disposition about such matters. Seeing the person next to you wailing as they're torn in half, leaving you showered in blood, would for several of the races in the darkened future give at least pause for concern, more likely running screaming in terror, but for the Orcs they would likely feel invigorated and positively encouraged to charge even more enthusiastically at their enemy. Orcs tend not to share the same concerns as other races with regard to the bigger picture concerning their race's general achievements, their failings, or overarching collective strategy. To put it simply, Orcs just don't really care about what's happening in the wider scheme of things. The result is that Orcs generally have one of the most objectively carefree lives compared to almost all others, save for perhaps the Tyranids, for who the concepts of fear, worry and disappointment or frustration even are surely completely absent. So with this in mind, you have to understand that it's really quite difficult to compile a worst or best jobs list for the Orcs, because you could generally consider they are happy for most of the time, and the worst jobs will more likely entail anything very mundane or that leaves them out of battle. Strangely though, when you think about it, Orcs often seem to generally love whatever they're doing, so this really makes it quite difficult to assign any kind of excessively negative or positive association with roles for them, much more so than other races where the concepts of ego and social impact are far more apparent and understood. Also, in regards to Orc culture, I'll include these sub-races like the Gretchen, the Grots, and Snotlings, the Snots, so we approach this with perhaps more the perspective of someone subjectively outside looking in, say an Imperial Xenos scholar perhaps, who could assign some more humanistic perceptions. As always, if you think I've missed an option to include here, tell me below, and we can look at it in a follow-up best-worst video. First up, a big guns grot. Now while Orcs as we know will run towards their enemy with glee and blood-curdling screams, they often will still use field artillery to back up their onslaught. These massive shooty guns are referred to accurately as big guns. Entertainingly hazardous to their operators as much their enemy, they fall into three main descriptions: Cannon, with a K, being a large bore shell of either a fragmentation or solid slug for smashing enemy armour. Lobbers are more akin to a big mortar, or sometimes even using a catapult with an explosive payload fired high to then land deep in enemy lines, dealing maximum damage. Or the stranger Zap, with 2Z's gun, which fires a large arc of electrical discharge into the targeted enemy. Operating any Orc technology is usually with a fair amount of risk, but for the Grots operating big guns, the nature of their powerful munitions means the chances of something being fairly unpleasant, as and when it goes wrong, are significantly increased. The Zap operator, for example, will deliver an electrical discharge relative to the nerve of the Grot firing the weapon. The firepower increases the longer the lever for delivery is held down and continues to increase the power of the shot. Too short and the weapon will do little more than spurt and crackle, and too long and the chances of it overloading and disintegrating its operator increases. Cannon operators, though, face the additional hazard of having to retrieve or inspect rounds, which could involve reaching down on a large enough cannon, perhaps climbing inside the barrel. Depending on the design of the cannon, this could be a dud round that needs replacing, or it could be a shoddy machine which caused a light strike not triggering the shell's primer. The likelihood of the Grot's operating mates resisting the temptation to try to repeatedly still fire the round, potentially shredding or segmenting their fellow operator in the process, is slim, not when much hilarity is to be had for those not risking life and limb. Even avoiding such catastrophic injury doesn't allow big gun operators to avoid their disabling effects, as the firing of such massive weapons will quickly deafen its gunners, leaving them to use very basic sign language of pointing and waving to get by, which rarely extends to any permanent form of more elaborate communication. On top of all this, big gun operators are unlikely to see with real clarity how effective the rounds they deliver to an enemy are, not with any grisly details, and so this, coupled with the debilitating effects of the weapons, lead them to be a role which few would opt for, and even for a passionate Orc or Gretchen, it's really hard to put a positive spin on this beyond helping other Orcs deal nasty damage to their foe. Up next would be experimenting, or an unnecessary surgery test subject. Now, Orcs are generally extremely tough physiologically. They heal fast and are capable of suffering extreme anatomical trauma that would either physically or mentally overwhelm most other mortal races. As with much of what Orcs do when it comes to medical treatment, this is not a studied field. Orcs do not study and learn how to repair physical damage, and more often than not it's probably unnecessary. Instead, some Orcs may simply lean instinctively toward wanting to and being capable of more effectively performing surgery and body modifications on other Orcs. In some cases where an Orc has been heavily wounded in a fight with another Orc perhaps, and is still deemed worthy of salvaging. A doc or pain boy, or perhaps later to be designated as a bad doc, may attempt some form of restorative surgery, or more likely adaptation and installation of some kind of cybernetic body augmentation. These kind of restorative procedures, though, are at best pretty crude, and where humans may use some kind of careful stitching of a wound or internal surgery, Orcs would just use a staple gun, which sounds pretty nasty, but bear in mind Orcs' heads can be detached live from their bodies for some time, and can even be transplanted onto another body if done before death. Worse than just the generally rough and ready medical repairs, though, are test subjects for docs. Like most other elements of Orc culture, like mechs, who love to just try out whatever they think would be a good idea to make a vehicle or mechanical more powerful in speed or firepower, a doc may decide that he's had a great idea for how to make an Orc work better. This could be through an Orc who was rendered temporarily unconscious, or one who has been brought in for medical repairs. They could have been perhaps persuaded that the doc's idea would definitely 100% make them stronger, bigger, or generally more capable at smashing their rivals. These unnecessary surgeries are often pretty horrific. Anesthetic, what's that? It's certainly more in the service of satisfying a doc's curiosity than they are about whatever end goal they were hoping to achieve. They certainly wouldn't have been tested out in any careful fashion, and are far more of a spur of the moment or improvised idea, a light bulb moment, which will often result in unpleasant injury, death, or extreme disfigurement than it would any positive achievement for an Orc. Still though, in terms of positive or negative, some Orcs would probably not care too much, considering that they would die while undergoing whatever horrible surgery the doc was attempting, and again, on the off chance that the doc was actually able to achieve his random inspirational modification, the Orc in question would certainly consider the unpleasant sawing, cutting and spurting to be worthwhile. But for those left ruined and more incapable than before, even by orc standards, due to the doc's surgery, it's hard to see how they could walk away feeling good about their situation, unless they were simply just too stupid and were persuaded by the doc that it was all a fantastic success. Not to mention when it comes to scars for orcs, the more severe the better, as they're seen as a mark of toughness and deserve respect. Except this usually is reserved for battle scars, but still, surviving horrifically brutal surgery has to be worth something. An Orc Commando is an Orc who prefers to use what qualifies as cunning and stealth for an Orc. They are infiltrators and saboteurs and prefer to ambush their enemy than they do run charging at it screaming for blood. This unconventional nature means they're often viewed suspiciously and with a relative amount of disdain by other Orcs, as much of their behaviour seems to run counter to much of Orc culture. Commandos will creep up on unsuspecting enemies, stabbing, slashing and slitting enemies' vulnerable areas before they can fight back, as well as strangely targeting munitions and resources in a seemingly unusually focused manner for an individual Orc unit. Because other Orcs often view those who end up in the commando role as being time wasters or just plain cowards who refuse to face their enemy head on with all guns blazing, commandos will often exile themselves temporarily or sometimes permanently so as to avoid having to engage in social interaction with others who would likely give them a hard time. Commandos are often even able to read other languages, as the Orcs who end up in this role usually are of a higher intelligence than your average Orc. Although to be fair, that's not an especially high bar to rise above. Still, how they are able to do this is difficult to understand. Likely, as with all Orc traits, it's a genetic and instinctive one, and they're somehow able to see patterns and systems within written language, enabling them to learn and more easily replicate languages of other races that they encounter. They then will turn this to their advantage in carrying out their sabotage or planned ambushes. While they may be largely shunned by their fellow Orcs for doing that sneaking about stuff, any war boss worth his teeth will recognise the commandos as being extremely useful assets that make for a far better outcome for any battle. Still, the role of a commando has to rank as one of the best or worst roles depending on how you look at it. For the commandos themselves, it's possible they feel a bit miffed about missing out on the goings-on of Orc culture, but on the other hand their disposition probably means that general goings-on go fairly against the grain for them, and so as with most Orc roles, they aren't probably that bothered one way or the other. On the more negative side of the coin though, having to put yourself in a self-imposed exile, as well as your skills and achievements generally being completely underappreciated by your peers, has to be somewhat of a negative, even if you're just getting on with your own way of doing things. When Orcs have no ongoing conflict, they need somehow to entertain themselves, and as with most things, this means finding some way to incorporate savage violence. It's basically a necessity. So Orcs will often arrange pit fights, either against native predators on whatever world they happen to have built up some sort of established town or city or control of the world itself, and they will of course fight against each other as well. This may also lead to a war boss's authority being challenged by a rival. Now these pit fights are of course popular as they entertain the whole warband, and so again it's a pretty hard one to argue that this is really a worst job in the strictest sense, but as I said, we have to perhaps just put anything which is not fighting in battle as a negative from maybe an outside perspective, because truly from an Orc's point of view they're going to struggle really to have too much of a negative or even strongly positive perspective on almost anything they do. Now pit fighting can also be used to settle grudges and serves as whatever loose sense of law, not really law, the Orcs use to guide their daily life. In terms of is it a best or worst task to have, pit fighting could be at its worst that an Orc loses their face or head to a rival in an arguably pointless one-on-one battle, whereas he could have done the same thing while smashing some filthy humanoids in the process. But far more likely it's seen by them as a glorious positive, whereby they contribute to the further social status of a rising Orc, or by gaining increased respect and power themselves by smashing his rival's head in or ripping it off. Not all the objectively bad roles to play in Orc society involve pain and or having your head smashed in. There is actually some social sniping that occurs even in Orc society. Most Orcs live together, rely and thrive upon this cooperative, albeit somewhat grating symbiosis. Orcs, Gretchen, Snot, Squigs, It's all by design, yet some exist on the periphery of orc society. And this can be optional, like orc commandos and to a lesser extent flyboys and speed freaks. Basically anything that's outside the realms of good hard fighting may be shunned, and while orcs who flaunt their violence and strength of smashiness to other orcs are celebrated and an integral part of orc culture, in order for a war boss to carry out a campaign, he may wish to acquire more tech and firepower. One source of this is the orc subculture of freebooters, essentially pirates and merchants who care a lot more about shiny things and wealth accumulation. Orcs like freebooters who love to show off their accumulated wealth and general swagger are not appreciated by most orcs. And this by no means is to say that all freebooters are showy posers who want to rub their accumulated wealth in the face of a clan. Some are fairly business-orientated merchants and straight-up pirates. Some though definitely enjoy nothing more than telling their fellow clanmates that they are considerably richer than you, and this general swaggering arrogance will be thinly tolerated by fellow orcs, and persistently shoving their wealth and success in the face of others will likely result in them being quite quickly kicked out of the clan on their arses. More than likely by the war boss themselves, who couldn't tolerate the thought of some lowly knob having weapons or tech bigger and more impressive than himself. The humiliation of being booted out there will be fleeting for most flash gits, who are probably still too blinded by their superior wealth to care and will undoubtedly end up signing aboard the local freebooters, desperate to find as quickly as possible a new source of teeth. While these flashy gits, as with most orcs, care little for the disdain and opinion of others, it's still pretty damning to be out on your arse for behaving like a flashy git. Snots definitely get the rough end of the stick in basically everything they're designated to do, but as always with orc kind, they don't seem to be too fussed about it. They are the lesser form of orc, smaller than a Gretchen, and they're usually only about half a metre in height. Their general weakness and ineffectiveness at any combat means they occupy the lowest levels of orc society. Snotlings will have the lowliest of tasks like fungus growing and of course livestock management. Livestocks for the orcs means squigs, a wholly unpleasant creature crammed with teeth and generally featuring a behaviour of biting whatever is nearest at all times. Snotlings have something for an affinity for working with squigs, again likely by design, and so not too many of them end up being bitten in half by the squigs that they manage. Nonetheless, it's hardly a task one would opt for out of choice. Squigs being hazardous to handle, some are bred as a food source, cooked or raw, and others are ammunition. Some might be strapped up as mobile IEDs, and some aptly titled face eaters are a heavily toothed variety which are used for orc entertainment in the always hilarious who can rip whose face off first contest. So you may imagine that for a snotling, handling these and other like the flesh eater squigs is somewhat of a hostile work environment. Each day might be your last, and you may find yourself writhing around on the floor without a face, likely to the amusement of supervising runturd orcs. A thankless task, your lot in life, the bottom of the pile, but part of the orc ecosystem and an essential one. Yet snotlings can also take on a more proactive role. While individually in battle they may be quite literally useless, as with much that is orc, strength in numbers is the name of the game. Snotlings can either spread through an area like a green wave, suffocating anything that falls beneath its sweeping tide, or they may even deliberately sacrifice themselves by crawling into enemy weapons and machinery to literally clog them with the dead. Only Tyranids have been seen to also exhibit this kind of behaviour to silence Imperial batteries. They can also be used as quite literal fodder, wasting enemy ammunition or just as a distraction. And finally, snotlings can even be used themselves as an especially unpleasant living ammunition. Shock attack guns use a narrow beam or force field to essentially teleport matter through the warp over very short distances, usually invisible range. And snotlings are the only orc creatures not to be smart enough to understand the consequences of this. In the process, they are driven into mindless rages of being propelled through even a short space of the immaterium with no protection. They then will be ported either inside an enemy vehicle, or worse, inside a target's armor, or even inside the living creature's own body. They'll materialize in a frenzy, immediately ripping and tearing and generally lashing out at whatever until they are either killed or die from ripping their own limbs and bodies apart in a mindless tantrum. Not to mention snots being fired through this nightmare weapon is said to materialize defecating uncontrollably. Such a terrifying process, they are quite literally shitting themselves. So for anybody looking at you guardsmen unlucky enough to have a raging snotling ported inside of them, the consequences are going to be traumatizing. Mech boys, or mechs, are orcs who have a natural affinity for engineering, inventing, and generally building orc machinery. This, as with orc surgical operations, have a somewhat if not fully improvised nature about them. While some mech creations are somehow fairly standard issue, for other things it often ends up being a matter of using whatever is to hand, and not significantly more complicated than just bolting X onto Y and willing it to work. Very much like the surgical experimentations some orcs end up being subjected to, a mech's technological experimentations may often end up being more deadly to those that they're operating on than they were to their actual intended targets. And this could involve some kind of extreme energy overload, as a mech had bigger ideas than his machine was actually capable of tolerating, leading to horrific burns, or just its operator being fried alive, some overtly complicated machine with gears and just a general over-the-top sense of sharp mechanisms could easily lead to limbs being torn off of bodies or pulled in and mashed through, just honest-to-goodness segmentation by energy fields or attempted clumsy warp utilization. Then again, the mech's odd creation of tech could prove too successful and become uncontrollable and become a literal loose cannon firing on anything, as its operator loses the ability to keep it directed toward the enemy with any moderate sense of accuracy. As with most things, it's really hard to consider if an orc would be happy or unhappy about being obliterated by the creativity of their own kind, but you could pretty easily speculate that they wouldn't be best pleased of being robbed of the opportunity to gun down their foes with the excessively powerful and destructive mechanisms that the mech promised would be a sure thing. It can be one of those things which, again, it could be a positive outcome for you, or it could be very, very negative. While much of studied orcs has shown them to enjoy surface dwelling to that of space or the skies, there are always those who buck the trends to take on specialised roles, and these are guys like the flyboys, a subcategory of orc speed freaks, and they go beyond that of the surface speed addicts. The flyboys need even further speed-fueled gratification, and this speed addiction only drives them to demand more and more exhilaration and more extreme behaviour. While orcs do not have specifically designated kamikaze pilots, which you might assume easily that they would, the nearest thing to this is the Blitzer bomber, basically a dive-bombing aircraft where pulling out of their dive at the last moment is generally the employed approach. This ends often with less than effective results, where the pilot instead plows straight into the ground, clouded by their addiction to go faster, and the result of this is often unintended kamikaze-like effects. However, orc bombers do contain a Gretchen-based suicidal delivery system known as the Grot bomb. These can be launched from a fighter bomber or also from ground-based mobile systems. Unlike a standard dumb bomb, the Grot bomb is more of a smart weapon, although the use of the word smart is not necessarily the best description. The Grot bombs are basically a rocket aircraft with a warhead attached, and they have sensors to assist the Gretchen pilot to guide the bomb to their target, the end result usually being more accurately delivered devastation. The Gretchen are then inevitably vaporized on impact, and despite the surety of death, there never seems to be any shortage of volunteers for the role of being a Grot pilot. While being referred to by some as orc slavers for their enslavement and subjugation of non-orc life forms, they are more regularly the equivalent of orc cat herders. These are the runt herds. Herein lies the subjective misery of their task, but again the positive duality of their role lies in the financial benefits for taking on this position few orcs would wish for, benefits that are fairly substantial. The self-explanatory title of Runt Herder tells you everything you need to know. They are basically the overseers of Gretchen and Snotlings. An endlessly irritating and thankless task, and most annoyingly a herder will likely spend more time whipping Gretchen and kicking Snotlings to get to their big gun positions than they will fighting themselves. As with all orcs though, these individuals play a critical role in orc society, because where most orcs have little patience for lesser forms, the runt herds somehow exhibit the rarest of orc traits, patience. This is rare among their own kind, but even less to have patience for the lower runt-like forms of the grots and snots. If it were not for this abnormal level of patience though, orcs would be continually slowing and inhibiting their own societal growth by too regularly casually ending those whose sole lot in life is to serve and provide the expansion for orc society. Still, patience as a description for runt herd is again not patience as we would envisage. It simply means that they're not going to rip off a Gretchen's head or break them in half just because they happen to do something slightly displeasing. Even more unusually, a herder will actually explain their duties to the lower forms and actively incentivize them. While the Gretchen and Snotlings live to serve, they still have opinions on their treatment and will only take so much abuse. Gretchen have been known to rebel and form exiled clans of their own when they felt that they were getting too raw of a deal in Orc townships. With all that said, a Runtard will with no qualms beat, batter and generally violently abuse the runts who disobey without a second thought. The best motivation is, after all, a proper good kick-in. Well-trained grots can be sold up to orcs, giving herders a regular and pretty substantial income of teeth in orc terms. Some runtards have even been known to train up snotlings to play a role similar to that of orc commandos. Just how this could be possible is one of the examples that almost anything is possible in orc culture. Some legendary runt masters have even created super grots and snots who have enhanced abilities through breeding and considerable patience in training. And so finally we come to the Rebel Gretchen. It's one thing to be the runts of Orc society, but at least you know your place, you know to keep in your lane. Yet some Gretchen have been known to buck this fairly established system, much to the disgust of all. It's not a common occurrence to be sure, but where it can happen once, it can happen again, and rebellion is a filthy, filthy word in the ranks of Orcs. Reactionary grots formed a committee to object to their systematic exclusion from joining a warg. Being forced to work their fingers to the bone but not participate in the big warg, this was too much, and many grots had had enough. When Gretchen revolt in numbers, filling their mech-town streets with diminutive green skins, they marched to meet Orc leaders, who would, on careful consideration as to what to do with these rebelling grots, decided the best course of action was, unsurprisingly, to beat the living snot out of the grots, punching and beating them with fist, rifle butts, and many a head kicking. This was a fairly poorly but quite obviously chosen option for the Orcs, who now set off a chain reaction of raging grot retaliation. Shops and slops were entered and smashed up, but the Orcs, only briefly stunned by such an outlandishly rare uprising, were more than happy to get in the mix and bang their bloody heads together, and much smashing, crushing, ripping and bleeding would follow. Some of the Gretchen would eventually surrender, but others instead chose a self-imposed exile to become rebel grots. Leaving the mech town, they'd walk for days to find a new home, and many would perish, and this only further embittered them to their former orc masters. Eventually, having found a new home and setting themselves up, these rebel grots are seen as some of the most despised by the orcs of a mech town. The rebel grots regularly will launch new raids to steal scrap, engage in sabotage, and generally sow discord. Their existence and ideology will usually bring new Gretchen recruits who are disillusioned by their orc masters. The rebel Gretchen are fanatical about their campaign against the masters that they feel gave them the right royal screw job. The rebel grots can also include snotlings who are either captured before they know what's what, or who just similarly run away. Any grots who rebel in this manner are fairly unusual and a totally counterproductive force, and they have to surely be considered as one of the worst positions to occupy in Orc society wherever they may occur. Their tactics of sabotage, theft, and even having been known to use captives as bargaining chips for ransoms or trades, they're surely a much hated and lowly faction of Orc culture.
Theros and a Hero of the Imperium by Gilliman. Wow.